Hello, everybody, and I'm glad to see that you're in a group today and enjoying your time together. Hopefully you've had some good fellowship time and some prayer time either before or after this discussion. And always good to be in community. It's always good to be sharing with each other. And we're glad you're talking a little bit in more depth over the message from last week. So the promise this week we looked at is, I promise to choose you every day. Now, at first glance, that may seem a little bit odd, maybe even a little bit awkward. How do you choose your spouse every day? Of course you do. I think the idea we're trying to get at this week is the idea that we need to make sure our spouses know that we are choosing them each day. Choices that we make affect our lives, impact our lives, some of them more than others, certainly. But one of the choices that is going to greatly impact your life and your marriage is the choice to make sure that your spouse knows that you choose him or her every day. The passage we've been looking at as our base passage from Genesis chapter 2 gives us the basis for this promise. Genesis 2 says, "This is the reason, or for this cause, a man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife." Bonds with his wife. Last week we talked a little bit about the first phrase. This is why a man leaves his father and mother, the promise of priority, making the spouse the priority in the marriage. God first, priority second, or spouse second. And now today, let's just move a little further. This week we move a little further. We look at that next phrase, and that is that he bonds with his wife. Now it's interesting, that word bond in the Hebrew is dabak. It's a primitive root, and it means properly to cling to or to adhere. Figuratively, in the Hebrew mind, it means to catch by pursuit. To catch by pursuit, to follow closely, to be joined, to keep, to overtake, or to pursue. We're going to take that idea of pursue and talk about that a little bit. The idea of pursuing, the idea of choosing, and ultimately the idea of consistency, because when we pursue, when we choose daily, when we pursue daily, then there is a consistency that comes to our relationship that brings the bond, that brings together the husband and wife in a very unique way. When couples pursue one another daily, the bonds of marriage, the bonding of marriage gets stronger. So we looked at two passages this week, primarily, or two parts of David's life. We felt like that David's life gave us an example of what it is to choose what is ours, and the example of how to choose, or what happens when we choose what is not ours. Now, when it comes to most things we have a tendency to pursue what we don't have, right? We have a tendency to want what we don't have. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when God said you can have fruit from all the trees of the garden except the one in the middle. And of course, which one did they pursue? The one in the middle. There's something about that hands-off mentality that makes us want something that is not ours. We would do well to learn to pursue what is ours. David's own son, Solomon, would write later in his book of Ecclesiastes that we are to enjoy our own wife, enjoy the wife of our youth. You have a spouse, you have a husband, you have a wife. You must learn, we must learn to pursue what is already ours rather than to pursue that which is not ours. So David provides a great case study. The first one we looked at was in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And there we have the very famous and familiar story of David and Goliath. You don't have to be an Old Testament scholar to be familiar with that. And probably if you were in a Sunday school class or a small group children's ministry at some time or another, or a vacation Bible school or an Awana club or any of those things, certainly at some point you heard the story about little David and Goliath. Well, it's an interesting story, and I don't really want to focus too much on the David and Goliath battle type thing, as I do something that happened within that story that shows us something very important. And that is, David made a decision, he made a choice, and he chose what was his. He chose to enhance what was already his. You remember the story goes that David had gone to visit with his brothers and to bring them a care package, if you will, from home. He heard the threats of the Philistine giant Goliath and noticed that nobody was going to fight him. So finally David goes to the king, King Saul, and says, I'll go fight him. And Saul says, you can't fight him. You're not a trained military veteran. You're not a warrior. You're a shepherd. And David says, I can fight him. So watch what happens when Saul finally consents to allow David to go to fight the giant. We find it in 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning in verse 38. It says, then Saul had his own military clothes put on David. Now, can you imagine that? David's young. David's a shepherd. Many believe a teenager. Saul, we know, was a big man. Saul, we know, was taller than all the rest of the men of Israel. So we know he's a big man. And yet he brings little David in front of him and he puts Saul's armor on him. He put a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. David strapped on his sword. Now notice the personal pronouns here for him. These belong to Saul. It's Saul's clothes. It's Saul's helmet. It's Saul's sword. David strapped his sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. Now we could have fun with that, but we'll save that for another time. I can't walk in these, David said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off. Now watch this. Instead, he took notice the personal pronouns. He took his staff, that is David's staff in his hand, and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi or the stream and put them into the pouch in his shepherd's bag. Then, with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Now my point is, a lot of things from that story, but the point relevant to us is this. Notice that David chose to take what belonged to him. He chose that he was not going to take Saul's or what was Saul's armor and what belonged to Saul. He was going to choose what belonged to him. And with that, he would fight Goliath. And by the way, the story ended well. And you well know that David killed Goliath, became a hero in the nation, and ultimately became king in Israel. Wow. David teaches us a very valuable lesson. We would do well to pursue what is ours and to pursue it daily. Now let's take that and talk about that a little bit in your group maybe. Maybe you want to talk about how you can take this principle and apply it to your marriage. But certainly we know this. As a husband, as a wife, we can pursue what is ours, and when we do, it ends well. Now, there was another story in David's life, you recall? In this instance, David was now king. He had sent his armies off to battle the Philistines, and he stayed at home. I've got to shorten the story. You can read that later if you would like to. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 16. You might want to take time to go back and review that and see the story of David and Bathsheba and how David looked down upon Bathsheba and lusted after her and said, I want her. I desire Bathsheba. Now here's the problem. Bathsheba was not David's. David had his wives and concubines. Bathsheba was not one. Bathsheba was already the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David had no business taking what was not his. But on this day, contrary to the hillside there in the Elah Valley, when he chose not to take what was not his, but to take what was his, this time he decided that he would choose what was not his. And so he had a relationship with Bathsheba. He hid it by having Uriah, her husband, killed. And you know the story. For 1 year, David was miserable. We find that out because he finally would later write in the Psalms, some of the songs that we read, David talked about his agony of guilt during that time. But after about a year, a prophet named Nathan came to him. And Nathan told him a story. And when he told him this story, David got under conviction because the story was about someone, a man who took something that wasn't his, took some sheep that didn't belong to him. David was furious and said, that man, whoever he is, that man should die. And Nathan pointed his finger at him in my imagination and said, David, you're the man. 2 Samuel chapter 17, we read about it. Verse 5, David was infuriated with the man and said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. Then Nathan replied to David, "You are the man." And you know that little story did not end well. There was division in David's house. David had problems with his family from that day forward. What a great lesson. David chose to pursue something that was not his, and it got him in deep water. So what's our point? What am I trying to say through all this? What are we trying to get to? We're trying to get to this fact that my first choice should also be my next choice. My first choice, for me, my first choice was Beth, and that needs to be my next choice. For her, her first choice is Eddie. That needs to be her next choice. And we must learn to choose each other daily. By the way, I'm going to throw a few things in the notes that maybe will give you some ideas about how to discuss how we can express to our spouse that we are choosing them again. We'll have some fun with it, and I really hope and pray that this study enhances your marriage greatly. I promise to choose you again. The promise we made, the second promise, the first of priority, the second of consistency. I promise to choose you every day. God bless you.